Almost there. And we are live. Hi, folks. So thank you for joining us today. This is a Southeast Asian conversation uniting around human dignity and denouncing Tony Pham as the head of ICE. As an accessibility note, we aren't able to provide translation, and we don't have a human being who's doing live captioning. However, we have a captioning app. What you'll need to do is log into this live stream with Google Chrome as your browser, not Safari, not Firefox, not any other browser. It has to be Google Chrome. And you would click on the link in the description of this live stream, and it will, and you'll have to click start captioning, and it'll start a live caption for folks who need it. And we'll make the transcript also available after the panel is over. So we want to open by bringing some folks into the space. We know that this work we don't do alone. Maya Angelou once said that I come as one, I stand as 10,000. And so we want to bring in Kajua Va, Chaya Chaum, Nancy Nguyen, Kat Bao Le, Dean Nguyen, Anup Prasad, Kai-Ying Yang, Bo Tao Urabe, Sylvia Rivera, Audre Lorde, James Baldwin, Bayard Rustin, Monica Roberts, Lorena Borjas, and there are so many more who we have yet to name. We bring these folks into this space as folks who have been fighting for freedom past and present, because we know that this liberation fight is a legacy that we inherited from others, one that we continue forging alongside one another. We know our work today is connected to both the past and the future, and that everything we do and say today has a purpose and a connection to all human beings, all life, and the earth. So we're here today to show up for our Southeast Asian collective family this morning as well. Over the past week, our loved ones in our Southeast Asian movement have been targeted by ICE, by Tony Pham as the acting director of ICE, and by local police departments for peacefully protesting over the past few weeks, for making their voices heard, which is protected by the freedom of speech and the freedom of assembly. They're being arrested, they're being targeted with arrest and jail time. Specifically, last Thursday on October 8th, our sister Nancy Nguyen was in the middle of changing her infant's diaper when armed officers entered her home without a warrant and arrested her. She was thrown in jail for almost 24 hours. Had it not been for local and national attention drummed up by grassroots organizing, by people all over the country calling the police departments, Nancy could very well still be in jail right now. Earlier today, this morning, Nancy and 8 other freedom fighters, including Kat Bao Le and Tin Nguyen from the Southeast Asian movement, and among this group is a multiracial group of organizers, including Black trans folks, who all turned themselves in to the Henrico County Police in Virginia after learning that there was a warrant out for their arrest. They couldn't afford being stolen from their home without notice, especially not knowing what might happen to their children. So as our comrades have said many times before, Tony Pham is not family. Pham is not family. My name is Swai Pham. I'm a Vietnamese trans organizer and artist from Orange County, California, where the largest concentration of Vietnamese refugees now live. Tony and I share the same last name. Our parents had to flee Vietnam, the same Vietnam. Many of their loved ones dead, many of them not knowing how they'd survive. And for me, that's fuel for the work towards a future where all of us can thrive. And that won't happen under the violent policies that Tony Pham is inflicting upon all of our communities. So it's been a week that's been fraught with emotions, even more so than when we first heard that Tony Pham would be appointed head of ICE back in August. I want other folks to introduce themselves on this call and tell us how you're feeling. Maybe we can start with Saret.
Thank you, Swai. Hey, everybody, greetings. My name is Sarat Suong, he, him, his, National Director of Southeast Asian Freedom Network, CFN. Wow, how I'm feeling. Feeling a lot of emotions. We're actually on our way back from supporting our comrades in Virginia this morning. We took the long road trip from Rhode Island yesterday to show support, to do some support, and to be there to witness and to make sure that they know that we have their backs. So I'm a little bit fired up. I'm exhausted, but I'm also really, really fired up. You know, since learning about Tony's appointment as head of ICE, it cut really deep for me. As a refugee myself, I'm a refugee from Cambodia. I was born in the refugee camps and came here when I was a young toddler. As a refugee myself, but also as someone who has of my life to fighting against the deportation of my refugee sibling. Hearing about Tony's appointment, it was a special kind of deep hurt because now we're protecting the refugees who came here, the same generation of refugees came here, and now we have Tony, who is the head of ICE, who's doing the deportation, who's making sure the deportation happens. And so, I think it cuts really deep. It makes me really sad. It makes me really angry. But then sometimes I take a step back and have to understand that this is actually, this is such a contradiction about how we exist here in the U.S. as Southeast Asians, as refugees, as a community. The contradictions that we must hold, and the contradictions of U.S. and American capitalism. And so in this moment, I'm trying to sort of think about that, be with that, and figure out how we move forward together as a community. And so I'm fired up because this morning it was a beautiful sight. It was amazing energy to be there. The 5-9, the folks who we got there, we showed up in the morning. We had a press release, a conference. They spoke, and then they, with so much courage and love, they walked in there and said we are turning ourselves in, and we all watched. It made me really sad, but I think it also really much energy in ways that the Southeast Asian community and the Southeast Asian movement, we're at a place where we have so much more connections and resources and infrastructure to actually fight back, even if it's something that looks like us as head of ICE.
Thank you, Surat. Kevin, I know you've also been supporting. Do you want to jump in?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Lam. I use he or they pronouns, and I'm with the Asian American Resource Workshop as the organizing director here in Boston, Massachusetts. I think how I'm feeling, I think there's a lot of different emotions. I think feeling angry at what is happening. And also, I think, similar with Sarat, I think there was a level of sadness and just a lot of emotion. Especially coming out of this morning's press conference. I think the appointment of Tony Pham as like the new director of ICE is nothing like it's not anything that is shocking, but it's kind of like here we go again around, right? Like continuing to use like Asian American, Southeast Asian folks as like a wedge around the issues that we're fighting against. And, I think the really emotional part from the press conference, I think, is like, even in the midst of a pandemic, right? Like deportations, detentions, mass incarcerations are happening prior to the pandemic. But even in the midst of a pandemic, we see that like prisons, jails, police, ICE are still continuing to like rip families and communities from their homes, from their community, from their neighborhoods. And, I think, I think they're seeing, I think as the press conference was wrapping up, I think there's a level of sadness and just like unpredictability of like folks who are turning themselves in, are they going to be able to walk out? And that, I think this is kind of a lived experience of like so many like folks of color who are having to interface with these larger systems. And, I think when we heard about like Nancy getting basically targeted and arrested at night, being ripped away from her like children and family, I think yeah, I think that was really, yeah, emotional and just, yeah, for someone, I think me personally, I think, and my relationship with Nancy is someone who I see as kind of like a mentor and friend in this movement work, who I met 9 years ago. Um, right. And so for me, just like seeing that happen, I think was really impactful. And also just the ways in which like our, yeah, this system continues to target folks now. But yeah, but I'm also angry, and I think that is fueling my energy to continue pushing even harder than we were before as a collective movement.
Hey everyone, Pham here, Tao with Man Forward. And I think a mix of high and low emotions, high being like hopeful and excited, and low being obviously, I think similar to what Sarat and Kevin had shared about frustration and sadness and hurt and experiencing harm again, right? I think Nancy's situation and with the folks that went in today again is really just teaching us about how our folks continuously get asked to be incarcerated or get asked to be sacrificed or are the sacrificial lambs, you know, and obviously these aren't the only folks who have been sacrificed, but we know that there's been plenty more over the course of the last 20 years, particularly in the Khmer community for the people who've been sent back already, right? I think the other thing that I'm hopeful about is that our families and our ancestors have taught us that we are going to get through this, and we can because they got through it. So it is in our blood. It is in our blood to resist. It is in our blood to be resilient. It is in our blood to overcome this. It is not something that we have not seen before. We've definitely seen things like this. It is his appointment obviously drives a further wedge in our community. You know, our communities are already divided in terms of who supports quote unquote the people that need to be deported back and things like that, right? And then obviously this even drives that wedge even further, and it makes it much more clear about who stands where in the community as well too. And I think that that's one of the pieces that is important for us is we get to really name the narrative that that's not what we want. We don't want to be used in that way, and our communities should not be used in those kinds of ways. And getting into these positions, like Tony Pham getting into positions like this, doesn't serve us a purpose at this moment. It really doesn't do us any good. So why are we proud of it? We're not proud of it. It's something that we're actually really hurt by and we're sad by, because again, it just drives that wedge deeper in our community, and it's a tactic that we've seen all too often, right? Because it's like, here's something, and then you go ahead and take care of the people that need to be taken care of, right, in the community. So I think that's what that's where I'm at this moment, and obviously really much appreciation to Sarat and the folks that went this morning and who were able to be there. I think the pandemic intensifies the ways in which we can actually mobilize, but we're being creative. We're being creative.
Thanks, everybody. So my name is Manta Chum, and I am the Executive Director of Release Minnesota 8 here in Minnesota. Whew. And much like everybody else, I have a lot of different emotions, very sad, very angry, especially after I remember hearing about Nancy the night that Nancy was picked up. And it was just hard to hear that. And you know, I think about just the traumas that we all have endured as Southeast Asian refugees, and to hear about Tony Pham and using his refugee status, right, as a way to make it look like he's doing the right thing in this position is very awful, and doesn't it's just really awful. And I'm still really emotional about what had happened, because it just reminds me of when we as an impacted person went through this with ICE, and thinking about the awful months that we were fighting, right, with ICE to get our loved ones released from ICE's detention, and then now to know that a refugee himself is doing this to our very own community is just disheartening. And we know that Tony Pham being appointed, and he's a Vietnamese refugee, and being appointed as the ICE head of ICE is a political move. And it's just a cover of what's happening to our communities. And we know that it's just very awful, and just a lot of hurt, I think, within our communities as we see what is happening. And I think it's the time for us right now to really continue to do what we're doing and calling him out. And like Pham said, there's a lot of resiliency within our community, and even though we're angry, it allows us to be able to fight even harder as we continue to do this work.
Thank you, Manta. I want to point to the fact that this hits really close to home. We went through a whole year. I mean, 2020 has been a whole different species of year. It's uncategorized, and you can't even categorize it. But I feel like over the past year, we have really fought to ensure that our communities go through a reckoning. We had the pandemic, we have the uprisings for Black lives. All these have been opportunities for our communities to determine where they stand, whether they're on the right side of history. And this has been the icing on the cake. It has, for so many of us, it hits so close to home because, like Manta said, we're often on the opposite side of this deportation process. Our communities are the ones being deported. And to know that Tony Pham, who not only has been serving as the principal legal counsel for ICE, but is now the acting director of ICE, is just unfathomable. And we have to remember that this, while this appointment is new, Khmer refugees have been deported since the early 2000s, right? And from the year 2018 to 2019, the numbers for Vietnamese and Montagnard refugees almost doubled, or pretty much doubled. And the targeting of Hmong refugees is something that is hardly talked about, back to countries in Southeast Asia that are already hostile to Hmong people. So there are just so many layers of this, and I want to really unpack the different layers because while Tony Pham is a Vietnamese refugee, and there's a whole narrative in the US of the Vietnam War, of Vietnam veterans, there's this whole narrative of Vietnamese refugees, but what people don't understand is that the war in Southeast Asia affected Southeast Asians as a whole, and many of the people who are facing deportations are refugees of that same war. So I would love to hear from all of you how this hits close to home for you, and why is it so personal? What does it bring up for all of you? Anyone who wants to jump in?
I can go. I'm just thinking about, for the fight that we are having, right? We must remember that we are here in the first place because of the wars that was inflicted on Southeast Asia. That's why we're all here. And so for us to be refugees and to flee these countries to come here, and then, we were placed in a lot of very over-policed, over-criminalized communities, and then to have to deal with, being placed in these places where a lot of these crimes, very minor crimes, also allows for us to be punished in a way that that we know that the white people wouldn't get the same types of punishment. And then when we change our lives, and yet because of ICE, and we also want to remember that ICE just came around in 2003. So just in a very short time, how much harm it's caused in our communities, and for us to be trying to be sent back to countries that we fled because the US, because of the war that was inflicted in our countries, is just really messed up. And so I just wanted to make sure that I mentioned that, because it is a bigger part of the issue that's happening within our communities, and people really don't understand. I mean, I think within the Southeast Asian grassroots organizing communities, we all understand why we continue to fight and do this work. But people who aren't a part of our communities don't understand that. And that's why we fight so hard to try to keep our families together. And it really shouldn't be that difficult for us to just be free and clear of, living without fear in being together with our loved ones.
Thank you, Monta. Sarat, you've been working in the Southeast Asian deportation, anti-deportation movement for decades now. I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. So how do I? Can you hear me? So how do I feel? I mean, okay. So before, when I was doing the how do I feel, I think I was trying to be all like measured and stuff. But like you asked again, so I'm like, how do you personally feel? I'm really fucking pissed. Um, and I'm pissed for so many reasons. Um, I'm pissed because I mean I know of a lot of Tonys in our families and our communities who worked for the police, who joined the military, right? And who I mean willingly, yeah, who joined these sort of institutions that created the instabilities in our home countries that caused us to come here as refugees in the first place, right? And so it's bringing me back a lot of all this sort of like trauma and anger in the past couple of decades doing deportation work. I think, but like I was thinking a little bit about like what are we asking for? We can ask for Tony to resign, right? We can say Tony resign. But for me, that's not enough anymore, right? I mean, we have to say in this moment we have to say, Tony, we need you to resign, and we need you to help us dismantle ICE. Like that's the only way. Like that's the only thing that we need to be asking, and of everybody in these sort of positions, right? And so because if Tony resigns, if we can get Tony out of office, I mean out of ICE, they're just going to replace somebody else, right? And even if Tony is, and even after if there's a new administration after November elections, and next year, they replace Tony, it's still going to be ICE. ICE is still going to do what ICE is going to do. And whether they put like a Southeast Asian person, a black person, or a brown person as head of ICE, the fight is still ahead of us. So, but there's something about this that uniquely hurts me as a Southeast Asian refugee myself. But I want, so I'm trying to sort of make sure that we keep our level head and that we use the anger and this hurt to fuel us towards the fight to dismantling ICE and abolition. I think that in this moment, what you were referencing, Swai, like yet again, like Black folks have created an opening for us in this moment to really imagine a system and a country and a world that is not reliant on prisons, right, and police. And I think for us as like immigrant rights organizers and anti-deportation org workers, we really got to also like take this moment and really think about what a world could look like without borders, without war, without U.S. imperialism, right? Because the very fact that we have a really messed up, awful immigration system, part of that's because it's tied directly to prisons and police in this country, right? And so if we can, we don't. For me, the goal is not to untie those things and have two separate entities like a broken immigration system and a criminalization system working, not hand in hand. We actually need to abolish this prisons and criminalization system, and we need an immigration system that is humane, that looks at people as human beings, as individuals who need support to live full, healthy, thriving lives. And so for me in this moment, there's also a line around what are our strategies, what are our short-term strategies around ICE, but like really what is our long-term goal to dismantling ICE? And how do we get there? So I'm pissed and I'm angry, but I'm trying to use my best to get those emotions and to help fuel our continued fight to dismantle ICE, abolish ICE.
Yeah, I think kind of, yeah, Sarath, what you were sharing, even just this like conversation about abolishing ICE. And I think for me personally, in thinking about, right, these opportunities in which I think a lot of folks are kind of waking up and seeing in this moment in time that they weren't seeing like in past years because of the pandemic, that, yeah, the systems and structures that have been set up have continued to fail like communities of color, immigrants, Black and brown folks. And that, yeah, I think the movement for Black Lives and like the push around defunding police and decarceration, I think has really also pushed around like conversations around, defunding ICE, defunding DHS, what does that look like and what does that mean? And yeah, I think for me, I think in the appointment of Tony Pham as the new ICE director and his identity as like a Viet Southeast Asian refugee, as well as the head of ICE, holds a lot of contradictions and a lot of hypocrisy. For me to understand that the ways in which he's like talked about his own family and background history of coming to the US as refugees and kind of upholding America as the savior, completely, I think, eliminates and removes the very aspect that Mantha was referring to, is that, right, like Southeast Asian communities are here because of war and genocide that the US was involved in during the war in Southeast Asia. And so when we look at that, and when he talks about his experience of coming to the US as a refugee and naturalizing and kind of those experiences, I think for me, it hits personally, because while like some of what he was sharing about his experience as like for his family and himself as a refugee in the US and growing up, while that parallels some of the experiences of my own family and community members that I know and grew up around, for me, it's also that history of war and genocide and the trauma that came out of that has impacted our communities. For me, what I really think about is, right, his role in this system and in spearheading ICE is creating a cycle of violence and trauma that is continuing to impact those very same communities that have already has suffered from violence and war and trauma from the war in Southeast Asia. And so, I think for me that, I think it really also comes down to like, what are people's values? And, I think for me, and the ways in which he upholds this idea of the US as a savior, but completely forgets that, right, we're here because, and Southeast Asian communities are here because we were displaced because of war and genocide. And so, yeah.
I think that what makes it personal is these folks that are being detained, who have final removal orders, who've been deported, are family, their brothers, sisters, siblings. They aren't anybody that is far removed from who we are. So I think that that's what makes it personal. Because of that, it's not only that shared history that is had, or that same experiences of being refugees, but it's that connection, right? And then it's, I think many of us have shared here about the separation piece, that you don't get to decide when and how this happens. There's no self-determination in that at all. And in the wars in Southeast Asia, the same way with the US's policy there, it came in and it said, you don't get to decide. You don't get to determine who governs your country and how it gets governed. Like I think about like the Hmong folks, when the US started losing the war in Laos, and they were winning, they were winning the war in Laos. Hmong folks in Vietnam were then recruited to fight Hmong folks in Laos, without ever being told that you're actually just fighting your family members, without ever telling that. And I think that that's the piece, right? Is this appointment is exactly that. It reaffirms to the people in our community who already believe that the US saved us, when in fact, it's really not that, right? Because we didn't get to determine who we wanted to save us. We didn't get to determine where we wanted to be. We didn't choose for our family members to be separated. We didn't choose for our brothers and our fathers to go into the military and die, or our forefathers and die, right? We didn't choose for women and girls to be left behind or raped or experience sexual violence through the jungles of Southeast Asia as they ran to Thailand into the refugee camps. We didn't choose all of those things. Those things were brought to us and was imposed on all of us. And I think it's the same way now. It's the same parallels that I think Mantha said it about us coming into the US. It wasn't like a great refugee resettlement program. It was a failure. It was a failure, the biggest failure of placing us into poor Black neighborhoods, displacing Black folks, then making us not then know how to build community with Black folks, right? So it started there. And I think that those are the things that we really have to look at in terms of this appointment, and in terms of why this is so personal to all of us, is it's all of those things. And we have to look at all of those things. And some people in our community may be thinking like, people had their opportunities and their chances. Yeah, there's a lot of opportunities and chances, but not everybody gets the same choices. Let's not forget that not everybody gets the same choices.
Thank you. Whew. What I want to reiterate is that there's a manipulation of the refugee narrative and what success looks like for refugees today. And for many of the people in our communities, success looks like Tony Pham. Success looks like entering a high-ranking position within a government agency, when we know and our families know that that's not the case. There are many Tony Phams in our communities, and there are many people like us who are resisting that narrative and ensuring that a real successful refugee narrative is the refugee who fights, the refugee who ensures that our families are not being targeted by the government, a refugee family that protects one another, looks out for queer and trans people, looks out for our disabled family. I want to point out that it feels especially personal to me as well, because as a trans person working within migrant justice movements that center particularly trans migrants, there have been many trans women of color who have died in ICE detention at the hands of Tony Pham acting as principal legal counsel. And there is still a Jamaican Black trans woman named Zaza, who is perhaps the longest detained trans migrant ever, who is still being held in Colorado at the Aurora Contract Detention Facility. So even as we speak right now, there are migrants, trans and otherwise, who are suffering in these prisons. We've heard of all the children, cis and trans, who were sick because of medical neglect, some of whom died. That was on the news when Trump got elected. So there's a huge cost to all of this, and I want to make sure that folks understand that this isn't this is actually a failed refugee narrative. This is a refugee narrative that has been subsumed under American imperialism and capitalism to brainwash us into thinking that what we need is to become them, to enact the same types of violence that they enacted upon us. And that's not what we want. I also wanted to connect these personal issues to larger systems, larger ways that the world is structured against certain folks. I actually want to start with Peng, because I know that a lot of your work is about resisting patriarchy. And Tony Pham is definitely a violent patriarch. And he's sitting in a position where he is using his patriarchal power alongside, let me say, a Black man who is the deputy director of ICE, in order to essentially be an accomplice to murder for so many people. So can you speak to the way that this is connected to patriarchal violence?
Yeah, I think it's just a continuation, because even though the US strongly believes that patriarchy doesn't exist because women get the right to vote and that women have been in positions of power, I think that's all false notions, right? And when we're talking about which women in particular, it was really affluent white women, rich women who got those things and who get into those positions. And we get to see that in the Senate confirmation hearings right these days with Judge Barrett, right? Is then a prime example of that. And so we become tools and pawns in these institutions that are built in the understanding of like that men rule the world and everybody else is under men. And anybody else who doesn't look like a man and doesn't act and behave like a man, therefore don't have those kinds of positions, right? And then, so then you put in folks of color into these positions thinking that it'll be something different, and it's not something different. It's just the continuation of the same thing, right? Even though in this instance, like we talked about, Tony may have the same shared experiences as us, but it's at the same time you're saying you're also wedging and dividing your community through that same system, right? through that same system and not recognizing the harm that you're actually causing at all, or saying, well, it's okay because I've made it here and this is what the community, and there's people in the community who actually support me. You know, we've seen that many times, just like the same things that happened with the uprising with George Floyd, when you had Officer Tutau there, and there's many Tutaus in the community. When we were talking about that in the Hmong community, that there were many Tutaus in the community, but yet we knew that there was also people in the community that were standing behind him, and it was mostly men who were standing behind him and who were running to save him and who were running to excuse his behavior. And so I wouldn't doubt that in living in patriarchy, it is also the men, the Viet men, who are coming to save Tony at the same time and stand behind him at the same time too, because it's not so much about him and trying to stand behind him, but it is also about trying to save them in the end as well too, right? And the willingness to sacrifice women and girls and queer folks and trans folks in all of this and forget about them, right? I think you were talking earlier about the folks who died in ICE detention, or the experiences that people have experienced in ICE detentions. And part of that is like a month ago, us hearing about how a woman of color have experienced, I'm losing the word now, have experienced being quote unquote cut up. Yeah. And that has always been a part of the US's history, is to do that to women of color. So we don't get to reproduce, or women of color can't give birth, right? And I think that these are really tactical gender-based violence issues. It's related to gender-based violence for that particular reason. And it also sees that men of color, and particularly Black men of color, aren't men in the system, right? That's why they could be killed and murdered by the police without impunity.
Yeah, I think even as a Cambodian woman leader, patriarchy definitely exists. It's very hard for men in our community also to really respect women as leaders. And that's something that, you know, before I started organizing, it wasn't anything that I feared or thought about. And until I came into this role as a leader in the Khmer community and being looked down upon and not being respected, and it's hurtful. I think about even being a faith leader and a woman in the church, how you think about all the senior pastors and the executive pastors, they're all men. And people don't want to believe that patriarchy exists, but we know that it continues to exist today everywhere, I think in all of our communities. You know, when we talk about the systems like ICE, you know, really exists, continues to exist to criminalize migration, right? And is a part of a massive, bigger, complex carceral system. And so I think it's just really hard for us to think that there isn't a lot of bodies and labors that are being put in front of the work that we're doing by women. I mean, you think about the deportation work, I think about even during our campaign, a lot of the people that were at the front lines fighting for these men are women and queer folks that are leading the work. And then we're fighting for our loved ones who were the ones who harmed us, right? And so I think that we have to really look at that and understand that that it's just really messed up how people don't respect women as leaders in this system. And so, yeah, I don't have too much to add to that, but just saying that, you know, we are important and we need to continue to speak up and do this work because we are who we are and we're going to continue to be here. Sarath, you want to go?
Yeah, no, you said exactly what I was going to add around, like, you know, after these systems deport folks, mostly, and the Southeast Asian, the Cambodian communities are mostly men who've been deported. Just a reminder about who really stays up behind, who picks up the pieces for the family, for the community, who does the defending, who shows up, who does the paperwork, who calls the lawyers. I just want to remind folks it's been Pham, women, queer folks who have done this and who've held the community together, even though oftentimes we're faced with violence ourselves. And so I think I think this is important to understand, because I think that when we think about how patriarchy affects us, we also think about the labor that we have to do to actually survive patriarchy as well.
Yeah, I feel so proud to be on this call with all of you. And I mean, I want to say earlier that when we talk about this successful refugee narrative, this is it right here. Everyone on this call committing their lives to the liberation of their people, to all people, is an example of the kind of refugee that we should celebrate, right? And our families and communities need to see that and celebrate that, as opposed to this exceptionalist narrative that Tony Pham is being praised under. Kevin, I know you have some thoughts. Do you want to share?
Yeah, I think just, echoing what other folks have shared, I think, what I've really reflected on is, right, a lot of the folks who I've seen in like movement work and organizing around deportation and even beyond, oftentimes, are like women, femme folks, like queer and trans folks, and oftentimes are the folks who are most often experience the most violence and harm are the folks who are like, when their own communities aren't creating space for them and holding them, that they're creating spaces and we're creating spaces for each other, but that we're still also like showing up for the people who have caused harm to us, right? And so, I think, I think all of this also comes back to this narrative and trope around like the good and bad immigrant, and this like idea of the American dream around this idea with the refugee narrative. Especially the one that Tony Pham, and we've heard it beyond just Tony Pham, that's been put out around America as a savior, but that it all falls under this larger upholding of like white supremacy, and just that, right, all these systems are to uphold white supremacy, and that people of color, folks of color, are sometimes put into these positions as like puppets or like pawns as a way to continue to uphold these larger systems. And that, for me, just thinking about the moment in which like community members and folks start to deviate from white supremacy is that when we start to actually be targeted by the state for like violence. And I think for me, I think the other piece is just that, I think the ways in which like there's like an aligning, I think, around just assimilation too, right? As refugees, I think for me, hearing like understanding that, my family had to do what they needed to do, and for them to survive in a country in which they were displaced to, that meant assimilating, right? Assimilation as a means of survival. And that meant that in living under like capitalism, imperialism, and under this country that really upholds that, how it has really removed people's humanity and seen like immigrants and refugees as like people, as like labor and as objects and as productivity, and actually removes like the humanity out of like people of color and immigrants and communities. And I think that is like what is something that continues to like kind of sit with me in thinking about these larger structures that we live under that continue to dehumanize folks.
Thank you, Kevin. There's actually something that Sarat said on a CFIN live right after Nancy Wing was, right after the campaign had launched to free her, and the campaign was successful, thankfully. But what you said, Sarat, was that we know that when armed agents of the state entered Breonna Taylor's home, she did not survive. And yet our sister Nancy survived when armed agents entered her home and stole her from her family. And that is a point that we have to raise up. I mean, first of all, rest in peace to Breonna Taylor, and our love to her family and her communities. We have to remember to situate this conversation, which for many people who aren't in movement work can feel very specific. Southeast Asian anti-deportation work is something that the general public doesn't even know about. But what we know is that this is part of a larger context. This is part of a larger battle for liberation. Earlier, Tu Tao was mentioned, and for many folks, Tony Pham and Tu Tao are just different sides of the same coin, right? They're just the same kind of way, the same product of the way that our communities have been complicit in systems that harm Black and Indigenous folks most severely. And we know that the same system that we fight, in this case, the immigration legal system, we know that the immigration legal system, while it deports us and hurts our families, it hurts Black migrants and Black refugees even more. And the data proves that. Black migrants from the continent of Africa, from the Caribbean, many of whom have to travel through Central America in order to arrive at the southern border. We are in unequivocal solidarity with the Black liberation movement, with Black migrant justice organizers. And so I want to bring this conversation towards the way that the arc of the year and how we've seen Black organizers, especially queer and trans Black organizers, really bring the world to a halt and shift our culture in ways that have been so incredible for everybody and that everybody benefits from. I mean, in Brooklyn, the March for Black Trans Lives garnered about 15,000 attendees, which is estimated as the largest ever in history attendance for trans liberation and trans rights. So for all of you, how are you thinking about how this is placed in context of a bigger picture?
I think we have to constantly think about those things, right? Like our work alone doesn't exist by itself. It doesn't exist just like as Southeast Asian folks only. We know we have to do the work in our community, but we also know that we are totally connected and must also be tied and be, as I think oftentimes Gajwa says, is that we have to be co-conspirators with Black folks as well in this country, right? That it can't be us doing our own thing on the side and just trying to save our own people. It doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way, especially if we're thinking about what does it look like for us to liberate our communities and what does it look like for us now to govern our own communities? Because you're not just governing Southeast Asian folks, you're governing everybody else together. And how are we going to do that, right? So we have to also be thinking about what is that piece, what is that vision, right? I think Brene Brown says it really well, is like, what is that vision for us if we were to govern ourselves? And I think that starts out with us making sure that we don't actually do this work in silo, but we're connected and that we're moving in motion together and in sync with each other, knowing that the system will continuously come in and divide us, knowing that the system will come in and continuously say, we're going to conquer you all and chop you all into pieces. But we've known, and like I said earlier, we've seen ways in which our communities have been so creative in coming back and being able to say, you can piecemeal as much as you want, but we're going to come as a meal and we're going to come back even larger and louder and prouder than before, right? So with this whole thing, I think even with what we did for Nancy in the CFIN call was that, yeah, like Chaya said, it got us angry. And thank you for making us angry, because we needed that fire, because we're going to push harder and we're going to do more. And you're going to also then be upset. And we don't care about that, because we have been so tired of these tactics, right? Of violence after violence after violence, and it's been nonstop. So that's my thinking. And I think we are, and I think that our leaders and our folks are connected to folks in the movement for Black lives and making sure that we're connected in those ways and moving in those ways that are needed.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think, thank you for raising that. So I think anything we do we have to think critically and build those real intentional relationships and be co-conspirators in for the current, for the movement for Black liberation, right? I think that we've been working on trying to make sure that we support and provide a flank to the current, especially to the current work that the movement for Black lives is pushing forward. I think like with Tony's appointment as head of ICE, I was just like in my head, I was like, wow, okay, we spent the last like decades defending our folks from deportation, and now they have a South Asian refugee there. Like this is like the kind of like a perfect setup for us, right? It's like we've been exercising this muscle to fighting this system. So they put one of us up there. All right, now we can like I can see clearly like our lane in this current abolition movement, right? This is our lane to really get Tony out and to really dismantle ICE, right? Like that is our duty and our responsibility. And so using that, connecting that, right, to the current calls for abolition, for the current defunding the police, because we know that the police and ICE and Homeland Security are all just parts of the same system, anyways. And I think that building more connections and becoming more, being more intentional around working with other Black migrant groups is really important. I think at some, we have to expand our, I mean, for us internally, we've always, our goal was clearly to end deportation, not just for Southeast Asians, but for all people, right? And be so like maybe talking more about that, contesting that one, actually putting that into practice, I think would be really good in these moments. And then all of that is also like sometimes I'm just like we're talking about this. We're talking about people moving, being deported, moving here. We're talking about all this as refugees who resettled here on a land that was built on indigenous genocide and Black slavery, right? And so sometimes it feels kind of silly to talk about who belongs here, who's not, who should leave and who should go, because it's not even our land and our home to be able to make that determination in the first place. So I think that at some point we really like have to contend with and talk about land, around sovereignty, about like what are we talking about when we're talking about abolition and borders, because that's always big a piece of the conversations that I want to talk about some more and get some more clarity about and come to some resolutions with, because then there's always going to be sort of a contradiction to me.
Yeah, and really just to add to that, I think about us living here in Minnesota and with the uprising and everything that's going on here around George Floyd and the aftermath. I just want to remind folks that like we continue, Asian folks continue to do this work, not because anything is transactional. We know that our liberations are tied to one another, but that we are committed to Black solidarity. And many of us on this call right now, we are part of SEAF and the Southeast Asian Freedom Network and have been doing the movement, like just being a part of the movement for Black lives for many, many years. And right now in Minnesota, I had this conversation with Soy earlier, is that, it's really great to see not only here in Minnesota, but across the nation, how there are a lot of API folks who are in coalition with one another to fight for Black solidarity. And here we are working right now to do a 2-part series of what it looks like as Asian Americans to really dig deeper into conversations around what it looks like without policing and how our communities can be the ones to be there to be the support for our communities rather than policing, and just re-examining what that looks like. And also another thing I want to mention too is that when people look at Tony Pham and they think, he came here the right way, and we think about like how the rest of us as refugees come here, how fucked up that is to even look at that narrative, right? Because then that really perpetuates more of the good versus bad immigrants. And I'm just thinking about, there was a Refugee Resettlement Act, but as Pham mentioned earlier, it was messed up, like the way that we've been resettled here. And that, if it wasn't for the civil rights movement, and if it wasn't for the anti-war and the urging of Black leaders to pressure the US to bring us here, we wouldn't be here. And so, but we don't continue to do this work just because of what they have done for us. We do it because of our love for the Black community.
Yeah, I think just echoing what other folks have shared, I think it's really important, especially in this moment, to not just see like the different movements as siloed movements, and that there's an interconnection, right? So like the conversations and organizing around defunding police is inexplicably linked to defunding ICE and abolishing ICE. And, you know, I think it was shared earlier, right? The Southeast Asian deportations, yeah, there's the linking between those two systems, but we know that it was because of policies in the 90s that explicitly targeted Black and Brown communities that Southeast Asian folks were then funneled from prison to deportation. And, you know, I think even in this year, I think what feels different too is that folks are not settling, right, for what they want and what was okay maybe in the past, but are demanding actually for like what is needed for their communities and for their families and neighborhoods. And even in the deportation work, I think, yeah, it isn't just about deportation. It's also about the criminal legal system. And it's also about like housing justice, right? Like we're also seeing like under this current pandemic, as folks are facing deportation, the impact that it has on like their families and loved ones to try to even remain in their homes and not be evicted, and the ways in which like folks are still just generally struggling to find adequate housing for them and their loved ones.
Thank you, Kevin. We have two questions from the audience, and then I'm going to move to a closing visioning question. But before that, I just want to note that for many of us, the way that we're removed from our history, the way that we're kept from history is intentional. I mean, if we look at how abolition has become a buzzword this year and how it's become more possible, it seemed more possible now than it had before for folks. We have to look at the history of where these sort of systems come from. So, I mean, we have to remind ourselves that the police and ICE as an extension started off as slave patrols and as militias, civilian militias to kill indigenous people. And we have to remember that when the US military arrived on Southeast Asian land, they actually called us Indians, mimicking the same tactics that they used when they colonized indigenous lands on Turtle Island, or what's called North America. So we know that the violence that we face and our communities face is an extension of the original systems of violence that were meant to harm Black and Indigenous people first. And so I want to segue into the two questions. The first is, what would it look like for all of our Southeast Asian people to resist and reject the legacy of violence from imperialism and the Refugee Resettlement Act? What does that look like to resist this violence also as it manifests interpersonally?
Wow, that's quite a question. So what do it look like for us Southeast Asians to resist? Can you rephrase that, Swai? Sorry.
Yeah, I got you. What does it look like for all Southeast Asian people to resist and reject the legacy of violence from imperialism and the Refugee Resettlement Act? The second part is, how does that resistance look when the violence is interpersonal?
I mean, I might be biased, but it looks like Sifen. It looks like queer, trans, like women, young folks, you know, coming together to support each other, to love each other, to build an analysis about why we are here, to build an analysis about the current, like the system that we're in, and to show up and to organize and to love our community so much that we are willing to put, you know, our hearts and our bodies and our love on the line to make sure that our folks are free. It looks like, you know, it looks like the campaigns we've done across the past 2 decades of both individual and national and international campaigns. You know, it looks and for me, what would it look like now is more. We need to do more mass mobilizing, more base building in our communities. We need to get more and more Southeast Asian folks to really sort of begin to understand this new vision for a world without police and a world without ICE. It looks like, you know, Southeast Asians, and we're doing this now, right? So to whoever's asking that questions, I really want to encourage you to look at the folks who are doing that work right now, right? It looks like fighting for reduction of like prison beds. You know, it looks like folks organizing to end agreements between local police and federal agencies and ICE in our communities. It looks like organizing fine to end direct transfers from courts and prisons to ICE. It looks like all of that. But I think for me, it looks, as someone who's sort of been in the movement and as someone who have tried to make reality that very question that was asked, I think that it looks as beautiful and as ugly and as painful and as joyful as our history and as our history together here in this country. Yeah.
I think that resistance is healing. Healing has to be a part of that resistance. And it goes in with that together. That is much needed in our community. It is simultaneous with that resistance, because as much as we resist and as much as we're actually enacting healing in that resistance. So let us not forget that. Let us not put a pause on that part of it. We talked about trauma earlier. So let's make sure that that's a part of that resistance. And I know people have been able to do it. It is also about the practices and ways in which we connect with each other as people, the ways in which we build relationships with each other that are actively creating places and spaces where violence isn't a choice and doesn't become a choice, right? It is also in the resistance that teaching our people the tools and the skills and having the resources to navigate that violence and to be able to overcome that violence, right? And understanding that when that harm has been caused in community, that we know how to care for that harm, right? Collectively. And then we also know how to do accountability with people who've caused harm. So when we look at like all of this violence is all connected when we looked at it and talked earlier, right, about patriarchal. This is all patriarchal violence. From domestic violence, sexual violence, to that of state violence, it is all patriarchal violence. It comes from the same system. It's the same patriarchal setting, framework, practices. It just looks different. It's just named differently. It isn't, and then we think it's a different form of violence. It's not. Let's not think for once that state violence is not connected to the violence that if you choose, right? Talking to the men who are directly in our community, and we do this work in Man Forward because we talk to the men who have final orders of like, us fighting for you means you no longer be doing this in your home. You no longer be enacting violence in your home. You are no longer going to be enacting violence in the community. Right? So I think that that's the interpersonal piece about the resistance, is that men also have a responsibility in all of this. Southeast Asian men in particular have a responsibility in this to resist that which they have been taught to have an active relationship with violence, that they must resist that and choose a different choice that's not the low-hanging fruit of violence, right? And so I think that that's what it is for me when we look at resistance. Resistance as an active form rather than a passive form of being, right? And it includes, again, the healing ways in which our communities have healed, the ways in which we have all thrived and shared for each other, like continuously share and share again, and continuously give and give again, and the ways in which we naturally help each other in community and support each other and be like, I'm going to think about the collective and I'm not willing to sacrifice anybody in this, right? So those are the small things that I think sometimes we forget in our resistance, is that those things count because it builds up.
Thank you. Our second question is, given that Southeast Asian refugees are products of American wars, how can we integrate anti-war efforts with our current anti-deportation work? Are there current examples of this being done?
Yeah, I can start, and I think other folks should add. Yeah, I think in my immediate thoughts and reflections to this question is just thinking still, I think in the context of like the war in Southeast Asia and the devastation and aftermath that came out of that we're still seeing to this day, right? Like there's still unexploded landmines in like Southeast Asia as a result of the war, in which like, you know, the US sent like soldiers there to fight in that war, which has caused like detrimental impact to like folks who are still living in Southeast Asia, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and that even the chemical warfare through Agent Orange and how that's been having like health impacts on folks like to this day. And so I think there are ways, or like for me, in thinking about it, right, is the framing around like Southeast, again, with Southeast Asian folks having been displaced from war and now facing deportation. They're being displaced and being sent back to these countries and deported to these countries that are still like suffering from the war from 40 years ago. And so I think there is overlap around the role in which like war and genocide have played a role in that, and also in the anti-deportation work. But I think.
Thank you, Kevin. Is there anyone else that wants to speak to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I ask that question all the time, you know. Yes, I mean, the war has never really sort of, I know for many of us, the war has never really ended, right? Still dealing with the consequences of it. But I do see Southeast Asian folks joining the war against Black folks in this country, joining the war against immigrants, refugees in this country. But I think like in terms of like actual like war, whatever, you know, whatever technical, like whatever that means, I think sometimes I think about like how do we move our folks to a place to be around like anti-imperialism, right? Because being anti-war to me means being imperialism, right? I mean knowing that an empire going out there into the world, colonizing, destroying other folks for resources, for money, for power, that all that's just fucked up, right? And that's what happened to us. So yeah, whoever asked that question, I want to know too. Who are the Southeast Asians engaging in anti-war efforts right now? I want to meet them. I want to build with them. I want to be able to like figure out how do we do that? How do we join that? I would love to have that conversation. I would love to meet those folks who are doing that. If you're out there, contact us.
Anyone else want to speak to that question? Otherwise, there's one more juicy. It's a good one. All right, let's move to the last Q&A and then we'll go to my last question for folks. So what does land back look like in the context of refugees?
Could anybody explain what land back means? I'm trying to catch up with these phrases and stuff.
Referring to, others should add, but I think it's referring to, it's like a slogan that's been used. I mean, it's kind of self-explanatory if you were to use it as a phrase, but it was used a lot over Indigenous Peoples Day this week. And I think it's been used as the hashtag to brand a lot of like pro-Indigenous things. Do other folks have more to add on what that is contextually? Okay, well, we can also interpret it as generally, what does like land sovereignty and like supporting that look like for refugees?
I mean, even like me not knowing that shows how much like I'm thinking about what land sovereignty looks like as a refugee here on stolen land on Toto Island. I think that like, you know, I've had conversations with Pang and stuff and other folks like, you know, what does it mean when we do things like, oh, okay, this neighborhood, we're going to create it into like little Cambodia, right? Like, how do you create a little Cambodia on a land that's like not ours in the first place, you know? So like rethinking sort of like initiatives or campaigns or development projects like that that like actually doesn't actually name the actual like true stewards of the land. But so pushing back against stuff like that, I think it is really helpful. You know, I think for me in the long term and stuff, yeah, I mean, as a refugee, as someone who is committed to liberation, when it comes down to it, I really truly believe that this land needs to be given back to the rightful owners of it, right? That for us to be truly for this country to really get to a place where we can like it is about true freedom and liberation. We have to hand it back. We have to say, this is your land. Can we work something out? Can we talk about how we can like, work together? But you have to ownership of this and we have to work with you around that.
Thank you, Sarat. I'd love to hear from Peng. I know that we each have a different relationship to land and our understanding of ancestral land. And for displaced Hmong folks, it's a different situation. And as folks who are also considered Indigenous, I'd love to hear what you think and how you connect your own experiences with this question.
Yeah, I was like for Hmong folks, who've never really had, right? And we didn't live in borders. We just knew that the next village over was where your cousins lived, and that might be in another country. But we didn't know that, right? And so I think that the land back piece of it is, I think it's really hard to really think about that because of how Hmong folks have been displaced all over the world at this moment. And then when we have to go back to the places where Hmong people have, like our ancestors have been, and even in China, it's not even in the right places. Hmong people living in right places, or they've lived in places for such a long time that they believe that that's where they are because the experiences of the newer generation is in that place and that's their birthplace. And so they then relate to that place in that way. And I think I've learned so much from the Hmong folks that live in Vietnam in terms of the generations that have been born in the heels of Vietnam, close to the borders of southern China, that's all that they know, right? But they knew that their ancestors came from somewhere else. And so I think it's a really, it's a question that we haven't really thought through. I know that for the elders and the community, it's the connection to their place of birth. And that's oftentimes how Hmong people think about it too, in this ancestral way of like, this is my connection to my birthland, and that's where I belong, and that's where I am at. But then that linkage is also goes back even further than just birthplace only. And so I think it's definitely a conversation to be had. And I agree with Sarat in the first place is that it has to, this land, if we're talking about the land that we are all on at this moment, has to go back to the Indigenous folks and needs to go back to the Indigenous folks first. Then they get to determine what happens next.
Thank you, Peng. We have time for my last question before we close. So I invite folks who are watching the live also to join us in this visioning exercise. So my last question is going to ask folks to reflect a bit and share what you envision in your head. One of the things that violence does to us is that it limits our imagination. It shrinks our imagination and what we believe is possible. And so many of us end up not even thinking about what a liberated world would look like for us. So for all of you, what does freedom look like to you? What aromas are in the air? Who do you see? Where are you? What sounds of nature are present? How are you transporting yourself? What are the relationships that you have with other people? How are people treating each other and the land? I can share as folks are thinking, and then I'd like to move to Manta first. So for me, I think a lot about the cycle of violence and how the reason why we hurt people is because we've been hurt ourselves. I think a lot about how trans women are hurt by cis women because cis women are hurt themselves. I think about how Tony Pham, as demonic as I feel he is right now, is a hurt person who has experienced pain as well, who has had a family that has experienced pain and trauma through the war and migrating here. And so I think we do that same kind of harm to the land because we are extensions of the land. We are the same as the ocean and the river and the tree and the sky. We're made of the same material, and we've been removed from the earth strategically by industrialization and to make us into consumers that hurt the earth. So I think about the ocean for sure. I think about what it would look like for free trans people, for free Black and brown people to convene by the ocean and just laugh endlessly, and to be able to commit their lives to something that fulfills them, for work to not feel like work. I mean, I don't think that we can live in a world where there's no work. Someone has to till the land, someone has to feed us. And so I just think about what it looks like to have work be fulfilling and in good relationship, in right relationship with the land and with all people and all beings, as opposed to stripping from the land. So those are the first thoughts that came to my mind. Manta, are you ready to share?
Yeah, it's so funny that you talked about like, you know, being in the ocean and stuff. I was just thinking about not too long ago when I was in Miami with Chaya, and we were out there for the movement for Black Lives, and how we were thinking about how we could all be in the, like over at the ocean, like having a different type of just visioning around being able to be together collectively with like our traditional clothes, like all the different ethnicities and cultures, and dancing and just having a really great time to be with each other in this solidarity and in this work and the movement. And then I was talking to Sarath earlier, and as funny as it is, I also envisioned like, you know, thinking about like the really great smells of Southeast Asia and like the stinky things and all of that, just like being able to live in peace and not having to worry about anything and just getting rest and just being healed. And yeah, I just feel like that's what we need for our communities. So yeah, just being able to just be together in harmony.
Yeah, I think for me, yeah, I think similar to Amanda, I think when this question was posed and around visioning, around what we see and hope for, I think, yeah, a lot of it for me, it really goes back to just like being re-grounded and re-rooted in like practices and just, yeah, I think practices of like the ways in which like I've learned how like my community, my family have like built relationships with other folks and really built deep relationships and built community. And I think really rooted and centered in like humanity and people's humanity and not productivity and not just the need to like always create and produce, I think is what comes for me. Yeah, I think a lot of laughter, being able to be in company with each other. And yeah, I've been thinking a lot and having a lot of conversations, I think, during this time, just with my parents. And I think for me, you know, I think my vision kind of like in the reason that keeps me in this work and like my hope around like what can be is really, I think for me is like what I often think about is like where like so many of our loved ones and like folks in our family have and community have gone through so much. For me, it just feels like a vision of like what it looks like beyond this moment is like for folks to finally be able to live and not just survive. And so, yeah, I think for me, that is like the core piece of it where people can just live and not have to worry about surviving.
Wow. So I've been thinking about this a lot, especially after coming back from a sabbatical, and having spent some time away from what I'm used to, from like sort of and everything, and having some mental and physical and emotional space to actually really think about what does freedom look like? What's the kind of freedom I want for myself? You know, I'm still trying to figure it out, and but I do know that I'm committed more than ever to working towards that for myself. But yeah, I was telling Manta earlier, to me, it smells like, you know, it smells like the crane dying. Like it smells like all the like herbs and stuff that I remember waking up to Saturday mornings when my like family's over and they're cooking and stuff. It even smells like the fermented fish. Like I love that smell. Oh my God. And so, but I think in terms of freedom, you know, I don't know, but what I do, but here's what I imagine a person to wake up feeling in this world. You know, I want, like, I imagine a person waking up. Oh, okay. Yeah, I have enough food today. I'm able to go see my loved one today. You know, if I'm not feeling well, I can get some stuff to make me feel better, you know? That like whatever I choose to be that day, however I want to talk, however I want to act, however I want to dance, however I want to sing, I can do that and people would join me, you know? Um, so that freedom to where all your basic needs are met, just your not just your physical basic needs, but your emotional, your mental needs are met, and not even just met, but just you have, there's so much abundance of all of it, that you can't help but just be your full beautiful self. To me, that's the kind of world I want, and that's the kind of freedom I want for all of us.
Yeah, I think to me, it wouldn't be too much different than quote unquote what's happening right now. But I would agree with both Kevin, Sarat, and what Manta shared is that people have the tools and the skills and the resources to navigate their lives the way that they want to actually navigate it. And again, that we're in community, we're able to practice traditions and rituals that aren't violent, that aren't harmful to sets of people, or that we're not using it to marginalize folks or invisibilize identities in the community. I think that what it would be like, the worries that I would have is one of the things that we often joke about, like Sarath knows this very well, is like just making sure that there's AC when we go to hot countries. that would be the only problem that I would have to only worry about, you know, but that I don't have to worry about, like, is my family going to be broken, or is somebody going to be taken away, or somebody going to be harmed in that way, right? But that there's tools to be able to do that, and that we, like, worries won't ever go away, but that they will have a new set of worries that doesn't allow us to actually, like, continuously, like Kevin said, go to bat on surviving, right? What are we going to do next to survive? What are we going to do next to survive? What do I have to do? And that we get to worry about things that, quote unquote, maybe perhaps rich people worry about, you know. A friend of mine posted that up on Facebook the other day, that it's like, I've mastered poor people and broken people's problems so well, I want to level up to now mastering rich people's problems. Like, level me up to that place. And maybe perhaps that's what it is. Maybe perhaps that's what it's not. I don't know. But I think that it is definitely about balance in that place of liberation. It is definitely about harmony and peace. But it's not in a kumbaya. I'm not talking about it in kumbaya. I'm talking about it as very practical peace, practical harmony as well too. Things that can actually work and that are real, that we can practice with each other and we can do with each other in ways that, again, are not violent, in ways that, again, don't take people's dignity away, that don't take people's choices away and saying, these are the only kinds of choices you have. But if you're this kind of a person, you get these kinds of choices, right? That people get all the choices and opportunities that they actually can get in this world. And so I think that's the liberation piece for me. And it has to be very practical.
Thank you all so much. We have a couple demands. You know, as organizers, we always have to have a demand. So I posted in the comments of the Facebook Live, and y'all have an opportunity to say final words if folks are dying to say some final words. But the demands are to sign our petition to uphold human dignity and free them all. This is directed towards Tony Pham. The first point is to release all those detained in ICE migrant prison camps and immediately close said prisons. Second, halt all deportations during the pandemic. Third, work to guarantee protections for TPS and DACA holders before January 4th, 2021. And fourth, end ICE collusion with hate groups. We also want to lift up a toolkit to help protect freedom fighters who turned themselves in this morning. The toolkit is called the Drop the Charges Toolkit, targeting the Henrico County Commonwealth Attorney. There is plenty of information in there for you to email, to call, to take action in many ways. And lastly, please Venmo one-family, one spelled out as ONE-family, FAMILY, on Venmo in order to support folks' legal defense charges and to raise legal funds. We'll drop all of that information also into the description of this video after we jump off. But please take action with us. That's what's most important today. Thank you for listening. Do any of y'all have last words that you want to share with the audience before we jump off?
I was going to say exactly that. Thank you, Swai. The list you just did. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Sending y'all so much love. Good night.